I'm a long-distance driver. By the very nature of the work, I drive for many, many miles, and often way into the night. It can get pretty lonely, but I have listened to so many talk shows and audiobooks over the years. I almost feel like those guys are my friends. Anyway, you don't want to hear about that now. You came for the story. Driving up and down the countryside, you get to see some wonderful sights, and sometimes very unusual things. I've seen many things where I've had to rub my eyes and wonder, did I imagine that? I'm also not proud to say that I have been the cause of several deaths over the years. None of them have been nice, and all of them have left me feeling terrible. But you can cause more damage suddenly hitting the brakes than running over an odd fox or rabbit. Then, one day, I thought I'd hit a person. It was the middle of the night, pitch black, and I was on a really crappy road. On the way up to Scotland with a lorry full of bread for a supermarket. It was good money, despite being a bugger of a drive. You don't expect to see much on those roads. I hadn't seen a house for miles, and there were no streetlights or even cat's eyes on the road. I was humming along to something on the radio when I saw it shoot out from the side of the road, straight into my path. Now, as I said, when you slam the brakes on one of these things, you can risk fishtailing, even turning it, so you need to be 100% what you are doing. Hence, although I hate, and I do mean hate, killing any living creature, if it's a choice between me and the bunny is going to get it. However, I am not a murderer, and therefore, when a human-sized object appears out of nowhere, right in my path, no matter how dangerous it is to now slam on those brakes, of course I'm going to do so. Thankfully, because it was so dark and the roads are so bad, I'm not an idiot. I wasn't going that fast. Bang. Damn. I still hit it. Despite slamming on the brakes and hitting the horn and flashing my lights, this person-shaped thing didn't move in the road. The closer I had got to it, however, just before it collided with the front of the cab, I wasn't actually sure that it was a person. Yes, it was person-sized, but, and I know this sounds crazy, it looked like a person, but wearing a dog's head. That's right. This thing in front of me, that was about to be smashed to pieces, had a head just like a dog, complete with the yellow eyes you see on an animal when they reflect off your headlights. Once I had fully skidded to a halt, I climbed down out of the cab to see if the person, at this point, my brain couldn't process anything else, was still alive. I had my mobile in my pocket, ready to call for an ambulance. It had been a complete accident, but I didn't care if I got into any trouble. I just wanted to know if whatever I'd hit, was okay. I'd left the lights on. I just wanted to know if what I hit was going to be okay. I could hear a panting noise coming from the other side of the road to the one it had ran out from. I called out if they're all right, and that's when I heard kind of a panting. I called and asked for an ambulance. It was a dumb question, really. Nobody gets into a fight with a lorry and wins. But still had no answer. So I headed over to the noise and the lump. If they were panting, at least they were alive. And then I saw it. It was curled up and emitted a low whine. Its head bowed over its body. My first thought was that somehow there must have been a trick of the light, and all along it was just a dog. Not that I would ever want to hurt a dog, but it was a heck of a lot better than a person. At that point, I too was relieved to even question why the dog had been standing up on two legs, like a person. I called to it. I told it I wasn't going to hurt it. It gave me a small, low growl, and I started to wonder if I should just head back into the cab or leave now. I knew it wasn't a person, and I didn't think this creature would allow me to scoop it up and find an all-night vet's, when all of a sudden, this thing stood up, on 2 legs. So now, this growling, whining, definite dog stands up and faces me, standing taller than I was. I could see it was hurt. One of its arms, like a person, was kind of bent back at a funny angle, and the other was held to its stomach, where I could see a lot of blood. I'll admit, I stood there for a moment, mouth agape, wondering what to do. Luckily for me, this thing made the decision for me, because after staring me down with a look of pure hatred, it then turned and fled back from whence it came. I'm not sure how long I just stood there, gawking like some kind of idiot. Long enough to realize it was gone, and I needed to get the hell out of there. What the hell was that thing? Did it run off and die somewhere? Or did it go home and clean its wounds and recover? I'll never know for sure. My grandparents own a farm. I have been visiting there my whole life. I have ridden their horses, had milk from their cows, eggs from the hens. You get used to it. We used to stay for weeks each summer long, and I absolutely loved it. They were really hardworking people, but never too tired to give out a hug or even tell a story. One summer when we arrived, they looked a little more well-worn than usual. Now, of course they were older. They worked hard, and they were bound to look a little weathered. But this was more like stress etched onto their faces, and even that as I as a kid could pick up on. I remember them telling my mom and dad not to worry, but that it would be good to have some extra hands around the place and eyes, as there had been a spate of attacks. Most likely, the culprit was coyotes, and they'd been finding hens and even a couple of sheep ripped up. Grandpa had gone around and checked all the fencing, which sure had seemed secure. They were old school, had no need for security lights or cameras, and I doubt they could afford to have it installed anyway. They laid a couple of traps, but so far nothing. The night before we arrived, they had been woken by the sound of a commotion in the barn. Grandpa had ran down with his shotgun to hear old Bess, his prize-milking cow, getting herself in a state, and the horses making so much commotion. He heard something roar, as it made off quick as a flash. He hadn't even gotten the chance to even point the shotgun in the right direction, or catch a glimpse of what it was. It looked really big. Thankfully, Grandpa had scared it off before it had gotten a chance to do anything to the cows or horses. But it had definitely upped its game. Now, my dad was here too. They planned on staying up that night and seeing if they could catch whatever the hell this was. It was big enough to seemingly jump the fences and clever enough to avoid all traps. They didn't appear worried or scared like I would have been. More angry as it was hurting their animals and affecting their livelihood. So that night, Grandpa and Dad stayed up, waiting in the barn in darkness, loaded shotguns by their side. The animals weren't bothered by them being there. In fact, if anything, they seemed comforted by their presence. Around 2 a.m., they heard a noise. They didn't react immediately. They waited to see exactly what was going to happen, and if this was the culprit. Once they heard the sheep begin to bleat, They crept quickly, but quietly, out of the barn, guns at the ready. And then they saw exactly what type of creature had been attacking the farm. They said it was something out of like an old werewolf movie, kind of like the Lon Chaney Jr. in the Wolfman, except much, much bigger. It's easy to see how it probably just jumped the fence. It was tall and broad, and covered in a dark fur all over its body. It stood up on its two hind legs, which were bent at the knee joint, kind of like a dog's leg. And it had a huge head that closely resembled that of a Doberman pinscher, complete with yellow eyes and a huge snout, full of large, sharp teeth that overhung out of its mouth. Its tongue was nearly lolling onto one side, and breathing very heavy. Once they'd gotten over the complete and utter shock of finding a monster on the property, rather than a four-legged predator they could deal with, they both fired at Crazy. They then heard it scream. It was like an inhuman wailing screech that made them both cover their ears in pain, and whatever it was ran as fast as they had ever seen anything move in their lives. Dad gave chase, but the thing was gone in a flash. And, despite both being sure that they had hit it, there wasn't a single drop of blood to be seen. They stayed out there all night, just wandering around, looking and listening for any trace. The next day, when it was light, they went into the woods, backing onto the farm, and searched for any evidence of the creature, but they never found anything. You know, sometimes when you are just driving along, minding your own business, and then you see a dogman just sat at the side of the road. Well, that happened to me. I was on my way to a buddy's house for pizza and card games, something we try and do at least once a month. There, I was driving along a route that I use most days when something catches my eye. I can see there is something on the side of the road, and that whatever it is, it does not seem to be moving at all. I think it might be a large dead animal. Maybe a dead moose? It's not too far up ahead and on the driver's side, so before too long, I am level with it. I have slowed down to take a look because, in all honesty, I was pretty nosy. I couldn't work out from front to back what it was I spotted at first, so what on earth could it be? But now that I was right next to it, I still couldn't exactly process what the hell I was looking at. You know when your mind tries to find you reasonable and plausible explanations for weird stuff? That's what mine was doing. Because on the side of the road was what I can only describe as a dog that was clearly the size of a man. Or a dog with the body of a man. Hell, I don't know exactly how this thing is classified. All I can tell you is what I saw. It was sat down, which was why I hadn't noticed the height as I was approaching. But once I got level with it, it stood up. That was the only movement I saw, and the only thing that had confirmed this wasn't a leftover Halloween prop that somebody had just dumped out here. When it stood up, like a person would, I remember its two long, skinny legs. It was all furry, like an animal, and had a really skinny, hunched-over body, like a little old man who was starving and covered in thick hair. It had two long, skinny arms that were just kind of dangling there by its sides. And then, this big, almost out of proportion to its skinny body head. Now, I guess at first glance, I thought it looked a bit like a wolf, as I'm not exactly an expert on dog breeds. Having since looked at various pictures, like a cop looks at mugshots, I have decided it was more resembling a German Shepherd or a Husky. But it just stared at me as I drove past, as if it was the most normal thing in the world for me to see a man-sized dog that just stood there. It didn't look aggressive, and it made no attempts to come at me or give chase. It kind of just sat there. I kept on driving, and once I got to my buddies, I told them about it. I expected him to laugh or even accuse me of making things up. But instead, he just says that, oh yeah, my dad had told me about an old Dogman Monroe. Monroe was the name of the people who owned the land on the road, and decades ago, it just became known as Monroe Road, not its actual name. So it seemed that old Dogman Monroe was an actual thing. I guess it's just known about in locals to the area, but I had never heard of this before. Is there anything you can tell me about this? A couple of years back, my parents went out of town for the weekend. So, I did what every single teenager in my same position would do. I had a little party. Nothing too crazy. And thankfully, it wasn't one of the things that gets posted on social media. And before you know it, the entire high school shows up. But, enough of a good time that there were a hell of a lot of empty beer bottles and cans and other assorted debris laying around. I knew I needed to get rid of it. Not just to hide the evidence, but because I knew my hangover in the morning was going to be bad, and I wanted to make sure it was cleared up as much as possible before I hit the sack. So, I gathered all the trash up into a black sack at around 3 in the morning, lugged them all the way down to the alleyway at the back of my house where the dumpsters were. As I got near to them, I could see and hear something clearly snuffling around. Now, bear in mind that whilst not completely drunk, I was most definitely buzzed, and when I am like that, I don't tend to feel any fear. Liquid courage, if you will. So the fact that there was some sort of wild animal digging around in the trash didn't really bother me. Besides, we don't have bears or anything that dangerous. Nothing that would come this close to my house, anyway. So, at worst, it was likely some sort of dog, or raccoon, maybe a homeless person. Then, I heard a low sort of rumbling growl, an almost yipping sound. So I was pretty certain it was a dog, since I was only there to dump the garbage, not to challenge it to rotten food. I simply opened the dumpster and threw the bags in. It made a hell of a din from all the bottles, and that was when the dog decided to show itself. Now, I have already said that at the time I had been drinking, but you can bet your bottom dollar, as soon as I saw this, I sobered up real quick. Damn near pissed my pants. You see, this particular dog was massive. It seemed to be in a crouching position, and even then, it was huge, so I dread to think about just how big it really was. Then, it crawled out from behind the dumpster, and that was when my fear reached a whole other level. It was on all fours, but its legs were more like a person, so it looked awkward. Imagine a person in a werewolf costume, trying to run on all fours. How awkward that would look for them. It had a very humanish body, with patches of fur missing, like some mutt with fleas and mange. It walked like it wasn't used to being on all fours, sort of stunted. And its face, well, it was a dog head but with almost human-like features. It growled again, and I ain't afraid to tell you that I ran. Oh, I ran. As fast as I could, back to my house, where I then followed up by locking every window and door we had, and finally locking myself in the bathroom, all night. I've never seen anything like it. Was it just a diseased mutant dog? Is there any kind of dog disease that can make them look human? I don't know what it was, but I hope more than anything that I never see anything like it again. My little sister vanished in the woods when we used to play in when I was a child. The details of it are still very fresh in my mind. The problem is, nobody believes me how it happened. Thankfully, in the age of the internet, there's ways of finding people who are more likely to believe me than others. That's one of the reasons I've been enjoying your show, because it's taken me a while to work the courage to tell you my own story. If my sister was out in the woods, I was in the woods. Not so much because I enjoyed the woods as much as she did, but because she had a brace around one leg. If any woodland creature decided she was a snack, aka a wolf or a bear, she wouldn't have had any hope of escaping. Because so many years went by without an incident, I began to relax, and I think my parents did too. I kept telling myself that it wasn't a factor in the way things ended up, because on paper, there really wasn't anything I could have done differently, no matter how urgent I could have behaved. But that hasn't kept me from feeling down and guilty that I've never been able to fully resolve. So, the best place to start is to start with talking about it and telling it to somebody that might believe me. This story doesn't really begin with an encounter. It began several weeks prior, when I could tell that we were not alone in the woods. It didn't feel like there was a person out there. It felt like there was an animal presence. It's like the same way you can just tell that there were squirrels around, even though you don't necessarily see them. That's what I thought at first. But there's some sounds that a squirrel isn't big enough to make. And because I never saw anything, it was easy enough to write things off as just my imagination. I was 9, she was 6, and we lived on our own property. So, we were very, very comfortable being where we were, even in the woods, since we had grown up playing in it. I would hear footsteps when we walked. When we held still, whatever was out there would hold still too. It was easy for my 9-year-old mind to think that it was just going to follow us around. It wouldn't be any real threat. Perhaps it was just a curious squirrel, albeit a very big one. One afternoon, I had been completely engrossed in watching some ants build an anthill. I was so focused that I didn't notice that I had not seen or heard my sister for several minutes now. So, I started looking around for her. I saw a movement between the trees, and I thought for sure that it had been her. But it threw me off because I didn't see any pink. I was sure that she had come out there wearing something pink. I was so determined to see something pink that my brain had been blind to a bunch of bland November foliage that turned out to be a live animal that I had never seen before. It turned to me and locked me with the most evil grin and evil eyes I could have ever seen. Small animal eyes like hot coals, with a very real light that emitted from them. I could only see it from the waist down, because it stood in some bushes that still had drab leaves clinging to them, which is part of the reason it was so well camouflaged. It seemed to hesitate. It then turned around and took off into the woods, as if just standing around and waiting and observing me like some new animal it had just discovered. It plunged deeper into the woods after a long moment of staring into this dog-like face. And when I say dog-like, think German Shepherd, but with similar markings and skin color of maybe a Rottweiler. I didn't quite have that instinct for danger that others had. Sure, I knew when to leave places because my well-being was in danger, but this was something else. I paused for a moment before actually trying to follow the thing, and when I followed it, I found the pink tank top that my sister had been wearing. It was torn, and something darker than pink had stained it. This came crashing into my mind as a sort of denial that can only be explained as the mind's attempt to persevere itself from permanent damage. A few paces forward, and I found the little jeans that my sister had been wearing. And yet after that, I found the brace from her leg. That's the point where I don't remember anything that happened afterward. It would be day 3 before I could form whole sentences to communicate what exactly I thought happened to my little sister. For obvious reasons, nobody was buying any story about any walking dog. And to this day, I'm convinced that the paw that was hidden from sight was indeed clutching my little sister. I can't help seeing strands of her hair poking out from between its fingers as it might have been clutching her by the scalp. It feels like a splinter that is driven deeper and deeper each time the memory rears its head. I honestly don't understand why these things are hard to believe in. The damage that they do is so obvious. If it's a very real threat to human life, then its existence should be treated as a real threat. Mountain lion attacks are rare, and yet there's an entire list of protocol for aiding people in preventing those. Why not have some kind of program or public awareness or campaign in place for these dogmen that roam the forest preying on whomever they come across? So thank you, what lurks beneath. I don't feel better, and yet I don't feel as bad as I did. I appreciate you and your platform for being an outlet for people like us who need to mourn, grieve, and get these stories off of our chest. Thanks. I was camping alone in a pine forest just south of the Appalachian Mountains, where the weather was quite cool. It was starting to look more like the autumn, so it was basically a fireworks display for the eyes. Nothing could have ruined the feeling of wholesomeness that I was feeling from the environment, until I had an incident happen. I convinced myself that I was going to be able to get up in time to douse the fire, stare at it, and if I felt myself drifting off to sleep, then I would get up and put it out. Well, that didn't happen. I ended up falling asleep, and I'm happy to say that a forest fire did not ensue. Nevertheless, it seems that the fire had caught the attention of something. There's still part of me that wants to think that it was a man in a Halloween mask. A very large, very well built and defined man in a very detailed mask. 'Cause in the dim light of the fire, I saw what looked like the sleek face of a wolf, or maybe some sort of Doberman Pinscher dog, just maybe a little wider looking, grinning and staring at me with 2 eyes that looked like fireflies. My heart had beat so hard that my pillow was vibrating and my mouth was dry. It was just cold enough that I could still breathe and see breath billowing out from its snout. It tilted its head at me in a very dog-like fashion. I wondered if it had noticed me and noticed that I was awake, because its upper lip started to peel back to reveal more and more teeth that were way too long and too many to fit inside its snout. Part of me hoped that it was the equivalent of a humanoid dog's smile, but the primal part of me laughed. What happened next is the reason I will never hunt another living animal again, as long as I live. Something else in the forest perceived this man-dog thing as a predator, and a large elk came running and attempted to hit the monster full on with its antlers. And, judging by the sound, it was a nearly fatal strike. The thing was so startled that it actually chased the elk. The elk seemed like it was ready to fight it off, and all this was happening in the dark. I couldn't believe it. Whatever this was some sort of crazy feat of nature. Something told me that the dog creature would regain its bearings and come back for me, remembering that it's a predator in this situation. But I wasn't going to use this as a chance to stick around. I packed up and left in the middle of the night. I know that's a bad time to be moving, but due to the presence of things like bears and wolves and whatnot, I packed up and left in the middle of the night. I know that's a bad time to be moving, due to the presence of things like bears and wolves and whatnot, but my fear for them was dwarfed by the new fear I had in connection with that unholy abomination that stood over me in the night. The sensation of fear does not come naturally to me. I'm not one of the people that automatically associate dark woods and full moons with all things horrible. I actually enjoy the night and the woods and nature. I don't cringe when I hear animals doing what they do, roaming the night and calling out. So, when something actually elicits a response of fear from me, then it's probably something that is universally, not selectively, terrifying. About me, I live in a small town, a little over 3,000, and I live right next to a park. It does close at sunset, but I can walk over there and walk the trails at night. It might sound strange, even unsafe, but I feel just fine with those unauthorized nighttime strolls. I had never felt threatened before. I couldn't see much. The light of the moon was having a hard time reaching past all the branches. I was happy to experience the dark. The occasional sound of an owl punctuated the silence. That one walk was the first time about hearing a sound that ever gave me chills. It sounded far away, and it kind of sounded near. It almost sounded omnipresent, like I was inside the stomach of whatever horrible animal could make such a skin-crawling noise. You would naturally associate a howl with a wolf, but this had an otherworldly aspect to it. You know how demonic voices in horror movies sound normal, but also distorted by pitch or some sort of other audio modulation. This howling had a very similar quality. It was natural, yet anything but. It was the closest I had ever come to experiencing a panic attack. The feeling of my body having an awful sensation without my consent was even more uncomfortable. I felt like I was losing control of the very box that my brain had sat in. The source of the howling wasn't merciful enough to silence itself when it was done. It devolved into a low mourning sound, as if there was pain into it. The trail dotted with lazy fireflies that flashed. I thought I saw 2 fireflies flying towards me, but then I realized they weren't the light of insects, but actually eyes. Eyes belonging to something that transcended the ordinary. The source of the howl was thus before me, and despite the dark, it stared at me. It, whatever it was, could see me. I don't know what it's from, but it's what came to my mind. Complete and total fear. The moment that my brain's signal would reach my frozen feet, I booked it. I didn't stop to see if it was following me. I don't think my brain would think past the impulse to run. The way my heart slammed against my ribs was agony, and yet also addicting. I needed to escape. I needed my heart to beat harder, so I could run more and faster. And just like that, I was a mess. I couldn't function the next day. I even called in for work 3 days straight, which for me is unheard of. I couldn't tell which was worse, running into a monster in the woods or being so completely out of control with the way my body and nerves felt. I was so used to mind over matter, and suddenly, I was at the mercy of this awful, reoccurring nightmare in my head. I didn't get a good look at the thing. All I saw was a general shape in its eyes, but those eyes were level with my forehead. The head they were set in was the source of this hellish growling and bestial grunts. I don't know if it had the face of a wolf and the body of a man or vice versa. All I know is that it made sounds nothing that an animal should make, and it broke my will. Look, it's been a long time since this happened, and I really feel the need to send this to you. After listening to your Dogman stories, it seemed to kind of fill in some of the blanks for me, and I thank you for making your program available and accessible like this. Ignore people saying that your stories are fiction. While I'm sure there are some, I can tell you that my degrading nerves aren't fiction, and the thing that caused my condition today certainly wasn't fiction. I don't believe in monsters per se, like the way horror movies and Stephen King novels portray them, but I do believe in animals with ill intents, and animals and creatures we have yet to discover. I'm going to start my tale by stating a very plain and simple and undeniable truth. My brother is a fool, and he isn't ever going to be able to undo it, any more than a leopard will ever change its spots. My brother bought a dog whistle to help train his burly pit bull. He began to notice that the whistle made this dog uncomfortable, and he thought the dog's suffering was humorous. So, he would randomly blow the whistle just to see the dog in sudden discomfort. He then decided to take his circus act to the woods behind his house during the warm season when the wolves and coyotes were more than about. He'd blow the whistle in the middle of a full symphony dedicated to the moon and the sudden changes in the sound. I told him on multiple occasions I thought he was being an idiot and being very cruel at best. I told him that one of these nights, if he didn't stop, he was going to call in the wrong animal, perhaps a bear or a wolf or something. I don't know what kind of animals can hear in that high of frequency, but I'm sure something would be drawn in. And you know what? I was right, just in an unexpected way. He wanted me to go on a walk in the woods with him again, and I told him that I wasn't going with him if he was going to play the wolf roulette with that darn whistle. He promised me that he'd behave, which is like a hooker promising to wear a skirt that goes beneath the knee, but whatever. No sooner had we gotten deeper into the woods, the idiot begins puffing away on that thing and sending the woods all around us into yowls and grunts. He kept laughing harder and harder. My fear was the funniest thing to him. I really didn't like him at that moment, and I was going to give him a lecture with my fists. He was my brother after all. I didn't have to be gentle, and I was really freaked out we were going to get attacked by a bear because he wouldn't put the damn whistle away. Now, what happened next is well deserving, I guess. A monster that I can only describe as black and gray, what looked exactly like a werewolf, flew out of the woods with the speed and grace of a squirrel, I guess. It nearly knocked us down, the force of it. I don't remember having to use the bathroom, but I sure messed myself when I saw that thing with its lips curling back, and my brother lying there on the ground in complete and total fear. He had utterly collapsed onto his knees from seeing this thing. Its stance was changing. It was beginning to act much more hostile. It lowered its head and arched its back like it was getting ready to do a death charge, where it would run full speed and swipe its claws and kill. I grabbed my brother, by the thick of the arm and drug him as fast as I could. Thank God we didn't have his dog with us at this time, because it would have just been a drag pulling that damn dog all the way back. We somehow made it, and I kid you not, without any wounds. This thing never followed us, even though we fell on our faces multiple times, tripping, getting cut, hitting branches, you name it. I felt like we got our fair share of ass-kicking by the woods, rather than this thing, our supposed executioner, that I feel that we should have died.